How does an RBMK society explode? Let's find out. So we find ourselves in a kind of hell. Charlie Kirk being murdered, innocent girls being killed on trains, people arrested for social media posts in the UK. How do we end up here? Here's how. Recent events have reminded me of the HBO series on Chernobyl. In this, one of the chief scientists, Legasov, says, "What are the cost of lies?" The Chernobyl reactor explodes because of inconvenient truths. Lies that seemed like little lies that later had horrific consequences. A lot of the problems we're seeing in society today come from just a few lies. There's 3 laws of lies that I'm going to lay out for you. Konstantin Kisin has reminded us that the term political correctness comes from the Soviet Union. Things could be correct factually, but not politically. Now, we've had this idea since the 80s, and at first of all, it just seemed kind of silly. It's like, do you want me to say that instead of this? And there was a bit of word policing, and eventually it escalated into like actually really coming after people, the cancel culture. I've had that. It was pretty unpleasant. It was mostly just people saying mean things about you online. Then people started losing their jobs, not getting hired, started to get a bit more serious. Because the truth has a way of coming out, lies need to be enforced increasingly rigorously. What are some of the lies that are involved that we're seeing come home to roost in horrible ways now? Let's start with this. Words can be violent. This clearly isn't the case. If you ask someone, would you rather me call you a name or punch you? They'll go for the name. Like a lot of these lies, this really comes from a good intention, perhaps originally not wanting to say mean things to people. Post-World War II consensus where we said, let's try and be nice to each other now. But making words the equivalent of violence means you can respond with violence to words. A discussion is ideas dying so people don't have to. It was no accident that Charlie Kirk was shot as a debater. He was someone that wanted to discuss ideas. Now, if we think that someone's ideas are equivalent to physical force, we are then morally justified to use physical force back against them. I don't believe that. So what starts off as a somewhat silly sort of policing of not being mean and not saying this, I remember at school saying, don't call your friend a spastic or whatever it was, actually ends up with bullets flying. The good intention of let's not bully or victimize people with words in this oversensitive environment becomes I'm equally justified in physical violence in response to any words I don't like. Eventually, this becomes people who disagree with me are not even human. At this point, horrific things can happen. The culture war becomes a hot war, and as someone who spent time on the ground in Ukraine, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, etc., you do not want that. You may think you want that, but when you're holding a dead child in your arms, you will realize you do not want that. So one lie is that words are reality. Another big lie is that reality doesn't exist. Physical reality isn't important. What matters is only people's subjective experience. So a man, for example, can be a woman if they feel like they are, they think they are, they have this subjective experience, supposedly, of being one. So the lie that a man can be a woman and vice versa, that the physicality involved makes no difference at all. This is crazy making. It's not just that man and woman is a very fundamental distinction that we have as human beings, that symbolic distinction that's at the core of our actual sanity, but the undermining of the idea that reality even exists, that physicality matters at all. So while there's a philosophical contradiction at the heart of this, to say there is no truth is itself the truth, and no one can actually live this way. I can pretend the water's not wet, but if I jump in, I'm going to get wet. This postmodern point of view that there is no truth itself, as well as giving everyone mental illness, creates lies that are just not sustainable. Another lie coming out of World War II was that the worst possible thing was racism and that everything was racist. This lie, of course, could lead us to release people from jail who shouldn't be out of jail, the case of the young Ukrainian girl, no killer. That white people by definition are bad, so bad things can be done to them, same case plus probably an element with Charlie Kirk, and that legitimate concerns around mass migration make you a terrible, terrible person, ignoring real crimes like happened with the gangs in the UK. Again, this may have started off as a fairly well-meaning, let's not be racist, let's not genocide anyone, of course, become a kind of hyper-vigilance from the trauma of World War II, but now ends up in extremes that requires lies to make them work. We have to not notice, as the people on the internet would say. Problem is, people notice, and then you have to close them down. And the last lie that stops us all discussing this is the lie that people that disagree with us are not real people. They're inhuman, they're subhuman. The lie that people that disagree with us can be treated as objects, can be killed, can be at first just ignored, not listened to. The deplorables, for example, Hillary's term, they're just deplorable. Don't even listen to them. I hear people say this about Brexiteers or nationalists in Europe. They're not really people. They're bad, they're evil, they're subhuman in some way. They can just be discounted. And eventually we get to the point where doing violence against them isn't really a problem because they're not really people. I disagree with that perspective, obviously. So there's 3 things you need to know about lies. Number 1, Lies have growing consequences. So lies disconnect us from reality. This creates an internal psychological tension, and you'll see that in a lot of the sort of hardcore activists, for example. But it also creates real consequences in the real world. So the RBMK reactors the Soviet Union had problems, and covering that up meant that one day they exploded. Consequences grow. First we ignore them, then we push them down, but eventually they come home to roost, and that is what's happening now in society. The lies that started off with the World War II consensus, again, maybe good-natured, end up in the hell we're in now. Next up, lies multiply. Again, sending us all crazy, making the whole things work. If you ever as a kid told a lie, you might have said, oh, a dog ate my homework. Yeah, but you don't have a dog. Oh, we found a dog. Where did you find that? And before you know it, you're like, okay, I've got a whole world I've got to kind of keep track of here. This is terrible for everyone's mental health, and we're seeing that in the world today. Lies are like cancer, they always grow. Lastly, lies have to be enforced. So things come through. Reality smells of bread. Consequences happen. If you run a business or you do martial arts or you run a farm, you're a woodworker, anything physical, you see this, right? Your illusions are shattered by the results, by the reality. You think you're a kung fu fighter and then a boxer knocks you on your ass. What this means is lies have to be enforced because reality is always trying to come through. The real world's always trying to say, hey, I exist, I'm here. If you jump in the lake, you're going to get wet no matter what you feel. Even if you identify as a dry person, it's going to happen. So what starts off as just telling people off, maybe a bit of tone policing, word policing, eventually become laws, eventually become prison sentences, eventually becomes shooting people. Eventually lies can't handle hearing the truth because their whole worldview is built on those lies. Subconsciously, I believe they often know they don't really have a good case. Like most people knew that man is not woman, woman's not man. Sort of obvious to most of us. Maybe we're kind of polite, we didn't want to say. But once you're committed to that, there's a cognitive dissonance involved that means you have to actively persecute anyone that's saying anything different. So how do we end up in this hell? I think we confuse being nice with being kind, and I'll do another video on that. We said, you know what, I just go along with that. It's, you want to dress up a certain way, you want to say that, I don't want to be racist, okay, just being nice. Not understanding that the lies would multiply and eventually have horrific costs. The second reason is that we lack courage. In a world where honor isn't a thing, where truth is no longer sacred, where most people don't have a connection to a spirituality or something deeper that's worth dying for, why would you inconvenience yourself with the truth? Why would you get cancelled? Why would you get fired? Why would you lose a client? Starts off with little things, and then before you know it, that framework of lies is in place, and then it takes real courage to stand up. Paradoxically, I think Charlie Kirk's death is going to be a turning point in that people can now see how viciously the liars will enforce their lies. And as a result, people will realize it's finally time to stand up. So how do we stop an RBMK society exploding? We stand up, we tell the truth, even if it costs us our lives.